Welcome to another historical Western romance audiobook. This is a cowboy romance, historical Western audiobook. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Clara Munro stepped off the stagecoach with an unsteady breath, her eyes scanning the dusty street of Canyon's End. The stagecoach rumbled away behind her, leaving her standing alone in the late afternoon sun, a small valise clutched in one hand and an old portrait in the other. Her fingers curled around the edges of the frame as if it were a lifeline, though it offered little comfort. The town stretched before her, a raw, growing place, rough around the edges, yet brimming with possibility. Wooden storefronts, some freshly built and others half-finished, lined the main street. A few horse-drawn carts rumbled past, the creak of the wheels mingling with the laughter and shouts of miners and traders shouting in the distance. The air smelled of freshly sawn wood and dust, the scent of a place still finding its footing in the world. Canyon's End. An untamed frontier town that had yet to be tamed. She glanced at the sign that hung above the half-built frame of her saloon. It read, Rising Phony, the rest of the name still to be painted. It was the dream she had built, the vision that had brought her all the way here. From the quiet town she once called home, her husband's portrait was still in her grasp, though she couldn't bring herself to put it away. It felt like a piece of him she could never quite let go of, even in a place as unfamiliar as this one. But she wasn't here just for memories. She had come for something far greater than that, something she could hold on to. Her fingers tightened around the small frame, and she blinked away the tears that threatened to surface. This wasn't a visit. This was the beginning of her new life. Clara squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to the way life could twist and turn when you least expected it. The past, heavy and full of loss, was something she could not afford to carry any longer, not if she wanted to make something of herself, not if she wanted to finally make her way in the world, beyond the shadows of the man who had once been her husband. Taking one last look at the unfinished sign of the saloon, Clara began walking toward it, her boots clicking against the dirt-packed street. Her gaze darted from one building to another, searching for the carpenter she had hired to complete the work. Samuel had promised he'd be here, and she had no reason to doubt him. But she didn't know him yet, and she didn't know this town. She was a stranger in a strange place, but that wouldn't stop her, not this time. The wooden doors of the saloon creaked as Clara pushed them open. The space inside was vast and empty, the only sound the echo of her footsteps on the bare floorboards. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the tall, grimy windows, and the scent of fresh-cut wood lingered in the air. The bar counter stood as a solitary reminder of what was to come, unfinished, worn, but full of potential. "Morning, Miss Munro." Clara turned to find Samuel standing near the far corner, wiping his hands on a dusty cloth. He was tall, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and a bit of sweat glistened on his forehead. His greying beard gave him the appearance of someone who had seen the world and learned to survive it, his eyes both kind and practical. "Good morning, Samuel," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "It looks like there's still quite a bit of work to be done." Samuel nodded, stepping closer and gesturing to the room. "We've made good progress, but there's still some finishing touches needed. You'll have to get your liquor license, too. Might be a bit of a hassle, but we'll get there. The floor's nearly done, though, and the bar will be ready soon enough." Clara walked further into the room, setting her valise down on one of the tables. She placed her husband's portrait gently on the bar, running a finger along the edge of the frame. The man in the portrait had never seen this saloon, never walked these streets, and yet somehow it felt like he was still part of it all. Like he was still here, in the space between the walls that were yet to be finished. "I'm new to all of this," she said quietly, her gaze lifting to meet Samuel's. the business side of things. I've never run a saloon before, never had to worry about licenses or permits. But I'm determined to make it work. I'm not going back. Not after everything." Samuel studied her for a moment before nodding, his expression softening with understanding. "I reckon you'll make it work, Miss Monroe. You've got the spirit, and that's half the battle." Clara smiled, though it was more of a weary tilt of her lips than the wide grin she might have once worn. "Sometimes you have to take the biggest risks to find a true home." The words hung in the air between them, simple but heavy with meaning. She didn't expect Samuel to understand, not completely, but there was something about this place, about the risk it entailed, that made her feel like it was the only way forward. If she wanted to rebuild, to start fresh, there was no other choice but to go all in. Samuel gave a short, almost rueful chuckle. "I've seen a lot of folks come and go through these parts, but not many with your kind of fire. I think you'll do fine." He wiped his hands on his cloth again, brushing the dust off. "I'll bring in some help tomorrow to get the last of the work done. Won't be much longer now, and you'll have a saloon of your own to run." Clara nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. The room, empty as it was, seemed to hold all the possibilities of her future, a future where she could make her own choices, make her own way. She glanced one last time at the portrait of her late husband before picking up her valise and walking toward the door. "I'll be staying at the boarding house tonight. I'll be back in the morning to see how things are coming along." Samuel tipped his hat to her, his voice gruff but kind. "I'll be here." Clara stepped outside, her eyes drawn to the half-finished sign of the saloon. She could already see it in her mind's eye, the rising phoenix, in bright letters, the doors swinging open, and the sound of laughter and conversation inside. It wasn't much yet, but it would be, and for the first time in a long while Clara felt that the weight of her past, heavy as it was, might just be lifting. Clara settled into the wooden chair at the corner of the bustling dining table, the worn upholstery creaking beneath her weight. Dotty, the kindly woman who ran the boarding house, bustled about the room. Her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. The rich aroma of stew and freshly baked bread filled the air, a welcome comfort after the long journey and the dust of the streets. Dotty's round face beamed as she placed a bowl of steaming stew in front of Clara, her apron covered in flour. "Now you just make yourself at home, Miss Monroe," she said, her voice light and cheery. "We don't have much in the way of fine china, but we have enough to fill a stomach and a heart, I promise you that." Clara offered a smile in return, the warmth of Dotty's hospitality easing some of the tension from her shoulders. She took a tentative spoonful of the stew, savouring the simple but hearty taste. The rhythmic clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filled the space around her, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax, to feel a fleeting sense of belonging. The long wooden table was filled with a motley assortment of guests, miners, travellers and the like. A grizzled old man with a thick grey beard sat across from Clara, his clothes caked with dust. His gnarled hands gripped his spoon with a kind of possessiveness, as if afraid someone might take it from him. He peered at Clara from beneath thick, bushy brows. "Name's Hank," the old man muttered, his gravelly voice cutting through the conversation. "You new around here?" Clara nodded, swallowing a mouthful of the stew. "Just got in today. I'm opening a saloon down the street." Hank's eyes lit up with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. "A saloon, eh? You know there's rumours about gold in them hills. Folks been saying there's a fortune waiting for the right man to find it." He paused for a moment, giving Clara a sideways glance. "Might be worth your while to take a look, if you're in the right kind of business." Clara's interest piqued, but she kept her tone even. "Gold? I hadn't heard. I'm just here to open a respectable establishment." Dotty, overhearing the conversation, gave Hank a knowing look and shook her head. "Gold is a fool's game, Hank," she said, her voice tinged with mild exasperation. "You can't live on rumours and half-dreams. There's real work to be done here, and that's what we focus on." The old prospector huffed but said no more, turning his attention back to his stew. The quiet schoolteacher sitting at the end of the table, who had remained silent up until then, gave a soft smile to Clara. "Ignore Hank," she said with a gentle laugh. "He's been chasing gold ever since I've known him. Not that he's found anything but trouble, mind you." Clara smiled in return, her nerves beginning to settle. The schoolteacher's presence was calming, her quiet confidence a welcome contrast to Hank's gruffness. The woman introduced herself as Miss Whittaker, a travelling teacher who had spent several months in Canyon's End, moving from one small settlement to the next. The conversation shifted to the mundane details of daily life, who was in town, who was leaving, and the general gossip that always seemed to swirl in frontier town. Clara listened politely, though part of her remained on edge, aware that every word she spoke was being measured. There was no mistaking it. The people of Canyon's End were watching her closely. They were curious about her, and more than a little sceptical. Dinner passed quickly, the clatter of dishes and the steady murmur of voices filling the space. Dotty, ever the hostess, refilled bowls and offered more bread, but Clara's thoughts began to drift back to the task at hand. Her saloon. It was her dream, but the reality of it felt far more daunting now that she was face to face with the town that would either welcome or reject her. If she was going to make it here, she needed more than just a name on a building. She needed to earn the trust of these people, to prove that her intentions were as honest as they appeared. After dinner, Clara lingered at the table for a moment, not quite ready to retreat to her room. Dotty, sensing her hesitation, smiled kindly and offered Clara a small attic room for the night. "It's not much," Dotty said, "but you're welcome to stay here for as long as you need. We don't get many newcomers, especially not women like yourself. I imagine the Marshal will have something to say about your plans, though. He's mighty strict about keeping things respectable around here." Clara nodded, a flicker of unease sweeping over her. "I've heard the Marshal's name. I'm sure we'll have to meet soon enough." Dotty's expression softened. "Don't you worry none about him. He's got his rules, but he's fair enough in his way. Just mind your manners, and you'll be fine." Clara smiled and stood, excusing herself for the evening. She followed Dotty up the narrow staircase to the small attic room, the steps creaking beneath their weight. The room was small but cosy, with a single bed covered in a faded quilt and a small wooden table by the window. Clara set her valise on the floor and sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit street below. She pulled the portrait of her late husband from her bag, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn frame. It was the last piece of him she had left, and yet, as she looked at his face in the dim light, she wondered if she was holding on to something that no longer served her. With a deep breath, Clara began to count the coins in her purse, carefully, as if each one was a fragile hope. The sum was small. Too small. She had barely enough to pay for a few more days at the boarding house, let alone keep the saloon open and running. What would happen if the saloon failed? What if the town rejected her, just like her old life had rejected her when her husband died? The thought made her chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She had come this far, and she couldn't afford to turn back now. A promise rose within her, one that she whispered to the portrait. "I'll make this work, for both of us." Her words echoed in the quiet room, and for a moment she felt the weight of her own resolve. She was here to plant roots, roots that would take hold no matter how hard the soil seemed to fight against them. Clara took one last look at the portrait before setting it on the small table beside the bed. She blew out the lamp, the room sinking into darkness, and pulled the quilt around her shoulder. Her thoughts were restless, filled with doubts and fears. But sleep came eventually, heavy and deep. Tomorrow she would face the Marshal. Tomorrow she would begin the next chapter of her life. Clara stepped out of the general store, her small parcel clutched tightly in her hand, the sunlight warming her face as it filtered through the sway of the storefronts along the main street. The day was full of movement, wagons clattering over the dirt road, horses snorting and stamping, and the occasional shout or laugh carrying on the breeze. It was a bustling town, still rough and young, yet brimming with life. She paused, glancing at the sign for her saloon down the street, the unfinished lettering standing as a quiet promise of what was to come. Clara's heart gave a flutter of hope as she thought of her dream taking shape. Slowly, a rhythmic clop of hooves caught her attention, and she turned just in time to see a tall, broad-shouldered figure riding down the street, his horse's hooves kicking up dust in its wake. The man's presence was undeniable, his posture straight and commanding, his face set with an air of quiet authority. As he drew nearer, Clara's gaze flicked to the silver star pinned to his chest, gleaming in the sunlight. The Marshal. He slowed his horse as he approached, his eyes scanning the street. The townsfolk parted respectfully, nodding their heads in quiet acknowledgment as they stepped out of his way. Whispers followed him, carried on the wind like scattered leaves, rumours, stories, and warnings about the man who wore the badge. Clara caught bits of conversation from the onlookers, his strictness, his no-nonsense approach, and the way he kept the town in line. Marshal Garrett Monroe. Clara swallowed the lump that suddenly formed in her throat. She had heard his name mentioned more than once since her arrival, always spoken with a mixture of respect and apprehension. He wasn't the kind of man who took kindly to newcomers like herself, especially not someone trying to open a saloon in a town already rife with rowdiness and unrest. As if on cue, Garrett's eyes landed on Clara, and his horse came to a stop in front of her. The soft jingle of the saddle and the steady creak of leather filled the space between them. For a moment neither spoke, though the tension between them was palpable. Clara stood tall, her chin lifted slightly, refusing to show any sign of unease. She didn't know why, but the man's presence unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way the town seemed to fall silent when he approached. Or maybe it was the weight of the badge on his chest that seemed to command respect. He cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Miss Monroe, I presume?" Clara nodded, her voice steady despite the fluttering nerves. "Yes, Marshal Monroe. I'm Clara Monroe." "I've heard you've been busy with your saloon," he said, his tone polite but firm, his gaze never leaving hers. "I trust you're aware of the kind of trouble a saloon can bring to a town like this?" Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression composed. "I'm aware," she replied evenly, the weight of his words pressing against her like a heavy stone. "But I intend to run a respectable establishment. I don't plan on stirring up trouble." His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, his expression unreadable. "A saloon attracts all manner of people, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low but firm, "and not all of them are the kind of folk we want in Canyon's End." Clara's chest tightened at his implication. She wasn't foolish enough to believe every saloon in the West was above reproach, but she had a vision for hers. Something different, something that could bring some life and excitement to the otherwise drab town. "I'll manage the crowd," she said, her words clipped but resolute, "and I'll keep it respectable." He studied her for a moment as if weighing her words, his gaze flicking to the half-finished saloon down the street before returning to her face. "I'll be keeping an eye on it," he said quietly, the steel in his voice unmistakable. "If things get out of hand, I'll be the one who comes to settle them." "I trust you won't make me have to do that?" Clara bristled at the implication, her lips pressing into a tight line. She wasn't some naive woman who couldn't handle herself, or the establishment she was running. But something about the way he spoke, like he already saw her as a troublemaker, struck a nerve. "I don't plan on making trouble, Marshal," she replied, her voice cool, her eyes steady. "But if you come to my saloon, you'll find it's exactly as I say it will be." The unspoken challenge lingered between them, a spark of friction flaring, igniting the air between them. For a long moment neither of them moved, both silently assessing the other. Then Garrett tipped his hat, his expression unreadable. "I'll be watching." His voice was low, almost a warning, but there was something more in it, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Without another word, he nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves scraping the dusty street as he rode past, leaving Clara standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She remained motionless for a moment, the tension in the air still thick around her. His words echoed in her mind, the promise of his watchful eye, and yet there had been something in his gaze, a flicker of something deeper, It wasn't just authority she had seen in him, though it was undeniable. There was something else, a pull beneath the surface that had stirred something inside her, something she wasn't sure she wanted to acknowledge. But she would prove him wrong. She would show him that she could run a saloon that brought something good to this town, and maybe, just maybe, she would find more than just a place to call her own in the process. Her hands tightened around the parcel in her arms, the image of Garrett Munro still vivid in her mind. She had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed, and next time she would be ready. As the marshal's figure disappeared into the distance, Clara squared her shoulders. The challenge had been set, and she wasn't about to back down now. Clara paused in the doorway of the Rising Phoenix Saloon, taking in the sight of the workmen hammering away at the walls, dust rising in the sunlight that streamed through the narrow windows, the smell of fresh-cut wood mixed with the earthy scent of sawdust and the faint musk of sweat. It wasn't much yet, but each swing of the hammer brought her one step closer to her dream. She'd spent the past few days overseeing the saloon's progress, keeping a sharp eye on every detail. There was no room for mistakes, no time for hesitation. She had to make this work, not just for her, but for the memory of her late husband and the promise she'd made to herself when she left her old life behind. As she stood there, contemplating the task ahead, the door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see Deputy Bill entering. He was a middle-aged man with a face that had seen too many rough winters. His eyes, however, were kind, though there was a hint of concern in them as he approached. "Evening, Miss Munro," he greeted her, tipping his hat politely. "How's the saloon coming along?" "Slowly," she replied with a half-smile. "But we'll get there. Another day or two and we'll be ready for business." Bill's expression softened, but his words held a certain weight. "I reckon you will. But you'd best be careful, ma'am. The marshal's got a way of shutting down saloons if he don't like what he sees." Clara's smile faded slightly, her gaze flickering back to the unfinished saloon. She had already heard whispers about Marshal Garrett Munro, his strict ways, his quick temper when it came to maintaining order in his town. He wasn't one to tolerate any kind of disorder, and the rumours suggested he had a low tolerance for saloons, especially ones run by newcomers. "Is he really that bad?" Clara asked, her voice more curious than fearful. Bill leaned against one of the support beams, his gaze lowering as he shifted his weight. "I wouldn't say bad exactly, just determined. You've heard the stories, I'm sure. He's shut down a few places in other towns. Don't take kindly to rowdiness or troublemaker." Clara's stomach churned slightly at the thought. She hadn't come here to cause trouble. She had a vision, one where her saloon could thrive without disrupting the town's delicate balance. But the marshal's reputation loomed over her, and with each passing day the weight of it pressed harder against her resolve. "Do you think he'll try to shut me down?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. Bill hesitated before answering, as if weighing his words. "Could be. But I've known Garrett for years. He's not all hard edges. If you can show him that you mean business and you're here to do things right, he might leave you be. Just don't give him a reason to start questioning your intentions." Clara nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. She wasn't a coward, she knew that much. She had already risked everything to come this far. The last thing she wanted was for the marshal to sweep in like a storm and destroy everything she had worked for. But what if she was too much of a stranger in this town? What if her efforts were futile from the start? She turned away from Bill, her gaze focusing on the unfinished bar, the tables stacked in the corner, the empty space that would soon hold her future. It was everything she'd dreamed of, and yet it felt precarious, like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. She had come here to start over, to build something lasting, something that was hers. She wasn't going to let fear or the marshal's reputation take that away from her. She had spent years running from the life she didn't want, and now she was finally facing the life she intended to build. One way or another, she would make it work. Her voice was firm when she spoke again, the uncertainty gone. "I'll have a soft opening. Not much. A few drinks. lurks, a handful of the townsfolk. Let them see for themselves what kind of place it'll be, and maybe, if the marshal stops by, he'll see it's not what he's expecting." Bill gave her a small smile, clearly approving of her resolve. "That's the spirit, Miss Munro. Show him what you're made of." "I'll show him," Clara muttered to herself, more to reassure herself than anyone else. "I'll show them all." Bill tipped his hat once more and made to leave, but paused by the door. "If you need anything, Miss Munro, don't hesitate to ask. Just tread carefully, all right? The marshal's got a reputation for a reason." Clara watched him go, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. She couldn't let the marshal's shadow darken her future. She had a plan. Now she just needed to make it happen. She turned back toward the saloon, her eyes sweeping over the work that remained. The workers would finish the last touches soon enough. She'd need to make sure everything was in place for the soft opening, to show the town and the marshal that this place was here to stay. With a determined step, Clara crossed the room, her boots thudding softly against the floor. She had come to Canyon's End with nothing but a dream and the memory of her husband's portrait. She wasn't about to let anyone take that away, not the marshal, not anyone. She would make this work. It had to. Clara stood behind the bar, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the polished wood, her breath catching in the sudden silence that had fallen over the saloon. The rising phoenix was officially open. She had promised herself that this moment, the culmination of all her effort, would feel like a triumph. And yet, as the door swung open and the first of the evening's patrons stepped in, her pulse quickened. The saloon wasn't grand by any means. The walls were still bare in places, the stage for the fiddler just a makeshift platform in the corner, and the air was filled with the faint smell of sawdust. But it was hers, and it was alive with possibilities. The lanterns had been lit, casting a soft glow over the room, and the freshly spread sawdust on the floor gave the space a touch of character, a quiet reminder that something new had begun here. Clara took a deep breath as the first handful of customers wandered in, some familiar faces from the boarding-house, others strangers who had heard about the opening. She stood taller, offering a warm smile as she greeted each one. She greeted them as though she weren't a widow trying to reclaim something she'd lost, but as a woman with a future. "Evening, Miss Munro," one of the men from the local mine greeted, tipping his hat. "Heard you were opening up tonight. Got a drink for a weary traveller?" "I've got just the thing for you," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She poured a drink with a practised hand, sliding it across the bar to him. "First round's on me." The man chuckled, raising his glass. "I like the sound of that." A fiddler, stationed near the back, began to play a lively tune, lifting the saloon with the unmistakable sound of a jovial evening, lifting the mood. A few others followed suit, settling at the tables and starting up low conversations. The atmosphere began to hum with life, the noise and chatter blending into a soft murmur of excitement. But even in the midst of this success, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the air, something that wasn't entirely celebratory. The gazes of a few customers flickered toward her with skepticism, whispers exchanged behind hands. The town still saw her as the widow taking a gamble, and the saloon was only the first part of that gamble. She had a lot to prove. Pushing those thoughts away, she focused on the task at hand. She continued to greet patrons, her smile practiced but genuine, her every movement careful, measured. The last thing she needed was for anyone to think she was flustered. As the evening stretched on and more townsfolk trickled in, the space began to fill. The crowd was lively but not unruly. People seemed to relax, enjoying the warmth and light of the new saloon. Clara's confidence slowly began to build, and with it the hope that this place, this dream of hers, might actually work. The sound of boots on the wooden floor broke her concentration. Clara glanced up, her heart giving an unexpected jolt as Marshal Garrett Munro stepped into the saloon. The light from the lanterns caught the gleam of his star-shaped badge, and for a brief, unsettling moment it felt as though all the noise and chatter in the room had quieted in response to his arrival. The door swung shut behind him, and Clara's eyes met his across the room. He stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his face as unreadable as the first time they had spoken. A few heads turned at his arrival, and Clara saw the subtle shift in the energy of the room, the patron suddenly becoming more aware, more watchful. His reputation preceded him, even here. He glanced around the saloon, his gaze lingering on the patrons and then on the bar. There was no visible sign of approval or disapproval, but the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly suggested he was already making assessments. Clara swallowed hard and walked toward him, her legs steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. There was something about the way he held himself, always aware, always observing, that made her feel small, as though her every move were being scrutinized. But she couldn't let that stop her now. "Marshal Monroe," she said, her tone polite but with an edge of formality. "What can I get for you?" He took off his hat, nodding as he placed it on the bar. His expression softened for a fraction of a second, the harshness that often accompanied his demeanor fading when he spoke. "A coffee, please?" Clara's eyebrows lifted. Coffee. Not whiskey, not beer, but coffee. She had to admit it caught her off guard. Most people would come in for a drink, but the Marshal wasn't most people. Still, she quickly poured a fresh cup from the pot sitting on the counter. "Here you go," she said, sliding the cup toward him, her hands steady as she did. He took a long, measured sip, his eyes never leaving hers as he set the cup back down. "Not what I expected, but it'll do." His voice was low, the hint of something... concern, curiosity, maybe even something else lingering in his tone. For a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Clara could feel the weight of his presence, the way his eyes seemed to be peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed facade. But then something shifted, a slight crack in his stoic exterior. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Seems quieter than I expected," he remarked, his gaze flicking around the room. "Not much trouble at all." Clara couldn't stop the small, almost relieved smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. "I've worked hard to ensure it stays that way," she replied, her voice steady. "This isn't the kind of place that welcomes trouble." Garrett's eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary, and in that brief silence there was an unspoken understanding between them. He saw her diligence, her commitment to making this place work, and she saw something softer in him, something beyond the lawman who had been sent to keep order. For just a moment there was no tension between them, just two people acknowledging without words the quiet effort it took to carve out a life in a place like this. But the moment passed quickly, as all moments with Garrett Monroe seemed to do. He reached for his hat and nodded once. "I'll be watching," he said, his voice low but not unkind. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she watched him turn, his large frame moving with quiet authority toward the door. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a second she was left with a strange feeling in her chest. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed impossibly wide, and yet something about their interaction had left her unsettled, her thoughts swirling like dust in the corners of the room. As the door closed behind him, Clara stood there, her hands still on the edge of the bar, her pulse quickening. She had expected him to be stern, to be the hard lawman everyone spoke of, but the brief exchange, so simple, so restrained, had felt like something else. A connection, or at least the beginning of one. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. There would be no time for distractions, not now, but as she turned to face the room again, she couldn't help the soft tug of curiosity that pulled at her heart. The Marshal's presence, his quiet watchfulness, it had ignited something in her. A spark, just a flicker, but one that refused to die out. The saloon was filling, the noise of conversation rising as patrons settled in. Clara's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since opening she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This could work. It would work, and maybe, just maybe, she'd find something more than just a saloon here. Clara moved fluidly between the tables, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor of the Rising Phoenix saloon. A week had passed since the grand opening, and the place was beginning to take on a life of its own. The laughter of miners, the clink of glasses, and the rhythmic shuffle of cards in the hands of eager players filled the air. It was everything she'd hoped for. A place of camaraderie, of refuge from the day's labour, a place that felt like home to so many of the town's inhabitants. A cheerful din echoed through the room as patrons settled into their usual spots, some leaning over their drinks, others shaking out the kinks from a day's work with a stretch. The low hum of conversation wove through the room like a delicate thread, carrying with it stories of the hills, of lost treasures, and of futures yet to be built. Hank, the old prospector with the wild beard and eyes full of secrets, was holding court at one of the far tables, his gravelly voice booming over the rest. "Gold's out there," he insisted, slapping a weathered hand down on the table for emphasis. "I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. It's just waiting for the right man to claim it." Clara smiled to herself as she passed by, the familiarity of Hank's tall tales never quite growing old. He had a way of getting everyone's attention with his claims of gold buried in the hills, and for some of the younger miners it was enough to keep them coming back, listening to him spin his yarns, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to unearth its secrets. But Clara couldn't linger on Hank's storytelling now. The saloon was her focus, and she moved through the room with practiced ease, stopping briefly at each table to check in with her guests, make sure their glasses were full, and share a few words. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it was hers. A loud voice from the far corner caught her attention. One of the miners, his face flushed and his hands shaking from too much whiskey, was getting a little too animated in his argument with another man. Clara's instincts kicked in before she even thought about it. She stepped toward the table with a calm smile on her lips, her voice quiet but firm. "Now, let's all take a deep breath," she said, her eyes meeting the miners with a steady, commanding gaze. "I don't think this is the place for fighting, don't you agree?" The miner's face reddened further. His fists clenched, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Clara didn't back down, keeping her posture relaxed but unyielding. She had learned quickly that the key to managing a saloon was not in wielding authority, but in knowing when to step in and when to let things play out. After a long moment, the miner grunted and turned away, mumbling something about the other man being a fool. Clara gave him a small nod of acknowledgement and turned back to the room, her heart still steady despite the adrenaline of the brief confrontation. A low murmur of approval rose from the nearby tables, and Clara couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This was hers, this place, and she was proving every night that she could handle the rough edges, the frayed tempers, and the constant churn of uncertainty that came with the territory. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself drawn to a quieter corner of the saloon, where Deputy Bill was sitting with a small group of men. His voice was low, but Clara caught snippets of their conversation. They spoke of the town, of the recent mining boom, and of the unpredictable nature of life in a place like Canyon's End. But then, just as Clara turned to head back to the bar, she saw him, Garrett Munro, standing by the door. His presence was impossible to miss, the room seeming to shift around him as he stepped further inside. His hat was pulled low over his brow, his eyes scanning the room, his posture one of quiet authority. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't been in the saloon since the night of the soft opening, and yet here he was, his gaze slowly sweeping the room, his shoulders taut as though he was still assessing her every move. Their eyes met across the room, and for a heartbeat the noise of the saloon seemed to fade into the background. It wasn't just his presence that had her pulse quickening. It was the weight of his gaze, steady and unrelenting, like he was peeling back every layer of her resolve and leaving nothing untouched. She looked away first, her cheeks flushing slightly, and forced herself to move toward the bar. She could feel his eyes still on her, but she refused to let it show. She had a business to run, and she wasn't about to let a lawman's scrutiny, no matter how unsettling, derail her. The evening stretched on, and the saloon's atmosphere became warmer, the laughter louder, the music more spirited. Clara moved through the crowd, her hands steady as she poured drinks and made small talk, but her mind couldn't help but flicker back to Garrett, his quiet presence in the back of her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. At one point their paths crossed near the bar. Garrett had come up for a drink, his posture stiff but not unkind. Clara offered him a smile, though it was laced with the remnants of their earlier tension. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice careful. "A whiskey," he replied, his tone low, though there was something almost reluctant about it, as if he didn't want to be here but knew he had to be. She poured the drink with practiced ease, sliding it toward him without looking up. But when she did glance at him, their eyes met again, this time more directly. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, as if the unspoken tension between them had somehow evolved into something more than just professional distance. "How's the night going?" he asked, his voice softer now, as though the business at hand had melted away for a moment. "Seems like the place is doing well," Clara smiled, but it was tinged with a certain sadness. "It's been a good night so far. I've been lucky, but luck doesn't last forever." "Luck is what you make of it," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful than usual. "You've made this work, Clara. That's no small feat." For a moment she forgot to breathe. The simplicity of his words, the way he spoke to her without the weight of judgment or authority, made something inside her shift. There was a gentleness in his tone, a flicker of respect that she hadn't expected. But before she could reply, a loud crash from across the room broke their quiet exchange. One of the miners had knocked over a chair in his haste to stand, and the noise quickly escalated into an argument. Garrett's posture immediately stiffened, his gaze flicking toward the commotion. Clara's heart sank as she saw the trouble brewing. Without thinking, she moved to intervene, but Garrett was already there, stepping between the two men with a quiet authority that commanded instant silence. His presence was magnetic, the room suddenly aware of the law that hung in the air around him. "Enough!" Garrett's voice rang out, low but firm. "You want trouble, take it outside." Clara watched as the two men muttered apologies, slowly backing away. Garrett turned back to the bar, his eyes meeting hers again, this time with an almost imperceptible flicker of something. He tipped his hat, his voice softer than it had been before. "I'll see you around, Miss Monroe." Clara watched him leave, the door swinging shut behind him. The tension in her chest was still there, but it had shifted somehow, as if Garrett's presence had come and gone like a storm, leaving behind an unsettling calm. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but one thing was certain. The lines between them, once drawn so clearly, were beginning to blur in ways she hadn't anticipated. The sound of fiddles and guitars drifted through the evening air as Clara stepped into the barn, her gaze immediately drawn to the swaying lanterns overhead. The wooden beams of the barn creaked softly under the weight of the laughter and music, the vibrant energy of the crowd spilling into the open space. The barn dance, sponsored by the local farmers, was in full swing, an event that brought together everyone in Canyon's End, from rough-handed ranchers to town folk seeking an evening's respite from their daily toil. Clara was standing on the outskirts of the barn, a touch of hesitation in her step. Dottie, her companion for the night, was already surrounded by familiar faces, chatting and laughing with ease. Clara felt the familiar stirrings of uncertainty, the same gnawing sense that she never truly belonged. This town, these people. They were warming to her, yes, but still, there was a wall that she hadn't yet breached. "Come on, Clara," Dottie called over, waving her hand toward a group of couples gathered near the center. "You need to join in. There's no harm in a little dancing, and the night's too beautiful to waste standing here." Clara hesitated, her fingers instinctively smoothing the edge of her dress. She wasn't the best dancer, but there was no harm in joining the fun. With a resigned smile, she nodded and started to make her way toward the crowd. But just as she was about to step forward, she caught sight of him. Garrett Monroe. He was standing just outside the circle of dancers, his tall frame casting a shadow over the flickering light of the lanterns. His hat was slightly tipped to the side, his arms crossed in front of him as he observed the dancers, his gaze focused and unyielding. As always, his presence filled the space, and Clara felt a slight tremor run through her at the thought of crossing his path tonight. A light touch on her elbow startled her out of her thoughts, and she turned to find Dotty giving her an encouraging smile. "Go on, Clara. Don't let the Marshal keep you on the edge," she teased, giving her a little push toward the centre of the floor. Clara took a deep breath and followed Dotty's advice. Her steps faltered only briefly as she joined a friendly ranch hand who extended his hand with a grin that was as wide as the prairie. He was a large man with a deep, hearty laugh, a stark contrast to the silent intensity of the Marshal. "Come on, Miss Munro," the ranch hand said warmly. "Let's show 'em how it's done." As Clara took his hand, she couldn't help but glance back at Garrett. He hadn't moved, his eyes still fixed on the dancers with an almost predatory focus. The sight of him made Clara's pulse quicken, though she couldn't place the exact reason. Was it because she feared his judgment, or because there was something in the way he held himself that made her feel both vulnerable and drawn to him? As the music began to pick up speed, Clara lost herself in the rhythm of the dance. Her movements were measured, awkward at first, but the ranch hand was patient, guiding her through the steps with easy grace. Laughter filled her chest, and she allowed herself to relax, enjoying the lightness of the moment. But as the dance continued, Clara's eyes kept drifting toward Garrett as if she couldn't escape his presence. His gaze flickered toward her every now and then, but there was no warmth in it, only that same unreadable quality that made him feel like an enigma, a riddle she couldn't quite solve. Then, as the music swirled faster, a loud shout broke through the crowd. Clara's heart skipped as a minor ruckus broke out near the edge of the dance floor. Two men, both obviously tipsy from too much drink, were shouting at each other, their fists clenched. The laughter from the other dancers died away as the tension in the air thickened. Before Clara could even take a step toward the conflict, Garrett was there. His movements were calm and measured, a steady presence that commanded the room without a word. The music faltered as everyone watched, waiting. "You two are grown men, or so I hear." Garrett's voice rang out, deep and steady, cutting through the whispers. "Act like it." The two men paused, then exchanged a look of sheepish realization, their bravado slipping away like a fading shadow. One mumbled an apology, and the other scowled but nodded. They stepped away from each other, the tension breaking as easily as it had come. The dance floor exhaled as the crowd resumed their merrymaking, and Clara, though still a little shaken by the brief disruption, found herself looking directly at Garrett. He didn't glance her way immediately, but when he did, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no judgment in his expression, no anger, only that quiet understanding that made her wonder if he saw something in her that no one else did. The ranch hand, noticing her distraction, chuckled as he guided her through another turn. "Looks like the Marshal's got everything under control," he said with a wink. "But you don't have to worry about him. Just enjoy yourself tonight, Miss Munro." Clara forced a smile, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She had to admit that the sight of Garrett, his calm and authoritative demeanour cutting through the chaos, unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the lawman in him. It was something deeper, something that made her wonder whether there was more to their interactions than what met the eye. As the night went on, the music became more lively, and the dancers more spirited. Clara, caught between the easy camaraderie of the ranch hand and the weight of Garrett's gaze, found herself more and more aware of his presence. She was drawn to him, though she couldn't say why. There was something in the way he moved, his purposeful stride, the way he carried the weight of responsibility like it was a part of him. Finally, as the music slowed and the evening drew to a close, Clara found herself standing near the edge of the dance floor, feeling an inexplicable tug toward the man who had been a silent observer all evening. Without thinking, she excused herself from the ranch hand, her pulse racing as she made her way across the room, her step slow but sure. Garrett stood near the side of the barn, his posture relaxed but alert as he watched the remaining dancers. When he saw her approach, his expression softened just the slightest bit. His lips didn't curl into a smile, but there was an undeniable warmth in his eyes. "You're not going to leave me out of the dance, are you, Marshal?" Clara asked, her voice teasing, though there was an edge of something deeper beneath the words. She didn't know why she was saying it, only that it felt right. Garrett paused for a moment, then held out his hand, his voice quiet, steady. "I didn't think you'd ask." Clara took his hand, her fingers brushing against his, the contact sending a small jolt of electricity up her arm. The music began again, slower now, and Garrett led her into the centre of the floor with the same calm precision that seemed to follow him wherever he went. They moved together, carefully at first, the rhythm of the dance flowing between them. There's no rush, no urgency, just a steady, measured pace. Clara felt her chest tighten in a way she didn't expect, her heart picking up pace as the distance between them closed. Their bodies were close, yet there was a quiet formality to it, as if they were both unsure of the space they occupied. They locked eyes once more, and for the briefest of moments, Clara forgot about the crowd around them. It was just the two of them, the dance, the soft creak of the barn, and the unspoken pull between them. "Seems like you know how to handle yourself," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's gaze softened, a flicker of something deep and unreadable passing through his eyes. "I try," he murmured, the words as much to himself as to her. The dance ended with polite applause from the crowd, though Clara's mind lingered on the quiet understanding that passed between them. Garrett stepped back, his hand lingering on hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said quietly, her chest rising and falling with the tension that still hung in the air between them. Garrett nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll see you back at the saloon," he said, his voice low, the words almost a command, though there was no harshness in them. As Clara watched him walk away, the heat in her chest intensified. The dance was over, but the unspoken bond that had formed between them remained, and for the first time Clara wondered what it meant. Clara stood in the back storage room of the Rising Phoenix Saloon, her hands wiping dust from the shelves. The day was still young and the saloon was empty. The quiet before the usual bustle of evening, she had spent the morning tidying the small, cluttered space where barrels and crates of supplies were stored, an unglamorous part of running the saloon, but one that required attention nonetheless. She felt at ease in the solitude, a brief moment of peace before the work of managing the lively crowd began. Her fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the corner of the shelf, a small wooden box, its surface worn and scratched as though it had been tucked away for many years. Clara paused, her heart giving a strange flutter in her chest. She hadn't seen the box in ages. It had been hidden deep within the remnants of her husband's belongings, things she hadn't quite been able to let go of after his death. With a slow, careful movement she lifted the box into her hands. The weight of it seemed heavier than she remembered, as if it held more than just old trinkets. She set it down on the counter, dusting off its surface with the hem of her sleeve before opening it. Inside she found a collection of small items. Papers, a few worn letters, a folded handkerchief that still smelled faintly of his cologne. Her gaze wandered over the items, her fingers brushing gently over each one. Then, at the very bottom, something caught her eye. A small medallion. She picked it up with trembling hands, turning it over to examine it more closely. The crest engraved on the front was unfamiliar, but it was intricate, a family symbol that had an air of importance. She turned it again, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving. M. The letter was etched into the metal, unmistakably bold in its clarity. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't recognize the medallion, but it had to mean something. Her husband had kept it close after all. She set it aside for a moment, intending to go through everything later, when she had the time. Her mind raced, but she couldn't seem to place the significance of the item. It didn't belong to her. Just as she was about to close the box, the sound of footsteps approached, the creak of the saloon door pulling her attention. Clara glanced up to see Deputy Bill entering, his usual easy-going smile on his face, though today it seemed tinged with something more serious. "Miss Monroe," Bill greeted, tipping his hat with a quick nod. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything. Marshal's asking for you." Clara's heart stilled at the mention of Garrett. She had expected this. The paperwork for the liquor license was still in progress, and the marshal's involvement in the matter was no surprise. He'd probably come to discuss it in person, as he always did, with his quiet authority and stern gaze. "No, not at all, Bill," Clara replied, quickly gathering the contents of the box and setting them aside. "What does he want to discuss?" Bill's face grew more serious, his eyes glancing down at the papers in his hand. "Official business, he needs to go over some things with you before it's finalized." He shrugged, his usual cheeriness masked by a hint of discomfort. "I'd best leave you to it. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. She had no reason to be nervous, but something about the marshal always made her feel off balance. She took a breath and stepped toward the small office in the back of the saloon. The door creaked as she opened it and entered, the walls lined with dusty books and the small desk piled with papers. Garrett Monroe stood at the desk, looking over a stack of documents with quiet focus. His broad shoulders were hunched slightly, his expression unreadable. His hat was resting on the edge of the desk, the shadow of the brim hiding his eyes as he glanced up at Clara's entrance. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice deep, the usual formal cadence of a lawman echoing in his tone, "we need to go over your liquor license paperwork." Clara nodded, a nervous knot in her stomach tightening. She knew the procedure well enough. Nothing complicated, just the formalities that came with running a saloon. She set the papers down on the desk, but as she did, her gaze fell to the medallion she had placed earlier near the corner of the desk. Garrett's eyes flickered to the object and he froze. The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous, his expression darkening. His eyes were no longer focused on the papers before him. Instead, he reached out, almost as if on instinct, and picked up the medallion. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she watched him turn it over in his hand. The engraving now fully visible. His face went pale, and for the first time since she'd met him she saw a flicker of something almost painful cross his features, a rawness that was quickly masked by a professional air. "Where did you get this?" Garrett's voice was low, tight, his gaze now fixed on her. Clara frowned, confused by his reaction. "It was my husband's," she replied slowly. "He kept it with his things." Garrett's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the medallion as his breath quickened. Clara took an instinctive step back, her hand rising to her chest in alarm. "Your husband," Garrett repeated in a whisper, his eyes flickering with disbelief, his voice trembling as the words left his lips. "This belonged to my brother." Clara froze. The words hung in the air like a sudden storm. She felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Her knees felt weak, her breath catching in her throat. "Your brother," she repeated, her voice trembling as she sought to understand. He dropped the medallion on the desk with a clatter, stepping back as if the very sight of it had burned him. His eyes met hers, grief, anger, and something much darker swirling in them. "He was an outlaw, Miss Monroe," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "A man I spent years hunting, trying to bring to justice. I never knew he had a wife, a new life." Clara's mind raced, her pulse hammering in her ears. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She had known her husband's past was murky, he had never spoken much of it, but she had always believed him to be a good man, a man who had tried to leave his mistakes behind. "No," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. He wasn't an outlaw, he was a good man. He worked hard, he loved me." Her voice faltered, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like a heavy stone. The shock in Garrett's eyes was mirrored by her own disbelief. How could this be true? How could the man she had loved, her husband, the man who had given her the only sense of peace she had ever known, have been someone else entirely? Garrett's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I hunted him, Clara. I hunted him down for years, never knowing that he had left a life behind, that he had a family." His voice was strained, his grief turning into something sharp. "And now you're telling me this was your husband?" Clara shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick. "I didn't know. He never told me anything about his past," she said, her words desperate. He was trying to change. He was trying to build a new life. He was never going to change, Garrett spat, his voice raw with anger and grief. I don't know who this man was that you loved, but the man I knew was nothing but trouble. I spent my entire life chasing him, and now I find out he was your husband. The space between them seemed to grow colder, the once faint stirrings of connection now shattered. The fragile bond they had started to form, built on respect and the slightest flickers of attraction, cracked under the weight of betrayal. Clara's stomach turned as she realized the extent of the deception she had unknowingly been a part of. She had loved a man who was part of the very darkness Garrett had spent years fighting. Garrett turned away, his shoulders shaking with a quiet fury. Without another word, he strode toward the door. Clara watched him go, feeling the world unravel around her. As the truth settled like a heavy fog in her chest, she was left standing there, trembling, the medallion on the desk a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The door of the Rising Phoenix saloon swung open with a soft creak, and Clara froze. She had been wiping down the bar, lost in thought, trying to put together the shattered pieces of her life after the storm Garrett had unleashed, with the truth about her late husband. But now, as the door opened, her stomach clenched. The man who had left her heartbroken and confused the day before was back. Garrett Monroe stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, his jaw tight with restrained fury. Clara's heart skipped painfully in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. His presence filled the room, larger than life, like a cloud darkening the space around her. She swallowed, doing her best to steady herself as she wiped her hands on the apron, trying to muster a calmness she didn't feel. Garrett's boots thudded against the wooden floor as he walked toward her. The door behind him swung closed, but the sound of the heavy latch echoing in the room made it feel like the saloon was closing in on her. He stopped in front of her. The silence between them stretched taut as if it were about to snap. "I need answers," he said, his voice low, controlled, but the anger was clear in every syllable. Clara met his gaze, her chest tight with emotion. "What do you mean? What answers?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but the tremble in it betrayed her. He stared at her for a long moment as if deciding whether to tear into her or simply walk away. Finally he shook his head, the hard lines of his face softening just a fraction. "I can't get this out of my head, Clara. I don't know what to believe any more." His eyes narrowed, and the disappointment in them was almost palpable. "You knew. You must have known, or, at the very least, you should have." "He was my brother." Clara's breath hitched. She took a step back, her mind reeling from the weight of his words. "No, Garrett, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about your brother. I didn't know anything about his past. My husband never spoke of family. He never told me anything that would suggest he was—" Her voice faltered as she searched for the words. "Anything like that." Garrett clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. His gaze was fixed on the bar, as if the wood in front of him were more tangible than the painful truths swirling around them. He abandoned everything. You don't just disappear and start a new life without something to hide, and now— His voice broke for the briefest of moments before he steadied himself again. "And now I find out you were part of that life. My brother, the man I hunted for years, the man I tried to bring to justice, had a family. And I never knew. How could you not know, Clara? How could you not have suspected something?" Clara's heart twisted in her chest. "I didn't know. I didn't even know about his outlaw past until yesterday. Her voice faltered again, but she pressed on. "He was a different man when I met him. He was good to me. He built this life for us. He wanted to leave all that behind. He promised me he would." Her throat tightened with emotion, and she fought to keep the tears at bay. Garrett exhaled sharply, his eyes dark with a mix of grief, anger, and a pain that ran deeper than she could understand. His jaw clenched again, as if holding in words that could tear both of them apart. His gaze turned to her, raw and conflicted. "I don't know how to look at you anymore, Clara. I don't know how to reconcile the woman I thought I was starting to understand with the woman who was married to my brother." The sting of his words cut through her, and for a moment Clara couldn't breathe. The space between them was too wide, and the chasm of hurt and confusion was too deep to bridge. Her mind spun as she tried to make sense of the mess that had become her life. "I didn't know. I didn't want to know, and now I wish I hadn't found out," she whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "But I can't change the past, Garrett. I never knew what he was. I never wanted any part of it." His face twisted in frustration, and he turned toward the door. "I can't stay here and pretend everything's fine," he muttered. "I need time to think." Clara watched him go, feeling a sharp, hollow ache in her chest. As the door slammed behind him, the saloon felt emptier than it ever had before. The faint hum of voices in the distance seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her own breath, ragged and shallow. Clara hadn't expected the fallout from the revelation to come so quickly, but the moment Garrett left, it was as though the saloon itself knew something had changed. The clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation felt distant, as though the world outside had shifted and left her standing on the edge of something she couldn't understand. She had no time to process what had just happened, not with the eyes of Canyon's End now upon her. As she stepped outside to catch her breath, she saw Deputy Bill waiting by the door, watching Garrett's retreating figure with a concerned frown. Bill didn't look at her immediately, his gaze fixed on Garrett, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. "What's going on?" Bill asked, his voice softer than usual. "That looked like more than just a quick visit." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. It's about my husband," she said, her voice shaky. "About the truth that came out yesterday, about who he really was." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "He wasn't who I thought he was, Bill, and now Garrett knows, and I don't know what to do." Bill's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "I know you didn't want this, Clara, and I don't think it's right for anyone to blame you. But some folks will. They'll say you knew. They'll say you had to have known." His tone was more cautious now, and Clara could hear the subtle warning in it. "I never knew," Clara insisted, shaking her head, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what he was hiding. I thought we were starting over." Bill nodded slowly, his eyes sympathetic but tinged with concern. People don't like things that disrupt their idea of how the world should be. They'll start talking, Clara, and when they start talking, they're going to make you the scapegoat. Clara's stomach churned at the thought. She had barely begun to feel like she belonged here, and now with Garrett's words still ringing in her ears, it seemed like everything was slipping out of her grasp. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I just need to make sure this saloon doesn't become part of the gossip." Bill gave her a small, understanding nod, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. "Watch your back, Clara," he said quietly. "Some things around here can get ugly when people start making assumptions." As Bill turned to leave, Clara looked out over the town, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. The saloon, her dream, felt suddenly fragile, as if the ground beneath her was beginning to shift. And yet, despite the growing fear, the doubts that began to creep in, she couldn't bring herself to back down. She wouldn't. But the storm that had been brewing was closer than she realized, and it wasn't just her past catching up to her. The townsfolk would start talking, and when they did, they wouldn't just be talking about her husband. They'd be talking about her, too. The quiet of the boarding house was shattered by a sudden deafening crack. Clara's eyes shot open in the dark room, her heart thudding in her chest. She froze, listening intently, her pulse racing with the dread of what she had just heard. The splintering sound came again, more distinct this time from the direction of the door. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Someone was trying to break in. She sat up quickly, her mind reeling as the silence pressed in around her. For a moment she did nothing but stare at the door, frozen in the dark shadows of the room, every nerve on edge. She didn't even dare to breathe, the silence between the splintering wood too heavy. Then came the unmistakable scrape of a knife on the doorframe. Her breath hitched. The figure was close. Too close. With trembling hands she reached for the nearest object, an old iron candlestick sitting on the small bedside table, her fingers slick with cold sweat. Just as she was about to rise, the door burst open with a violent jolt. A shadowed figure loomed in the doorway. Clara's scream broke the silence of the night, sharp and full of terror. "Clara!" a voice shouted from the hallway. It was Dotty. She had heard the scream. In a blur, Clara saw the heavy frame of the older woman burst through the door, followed by two other boarders, including a frail old man who had been staying in the room next to Clara. The figure in the doorway froze, his wide eyes narrowing as he saw the group rush toward him. With a quick, desperate glance toward Clara, the man spun on his heel and fled down the narrow hall, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Clara's heart still raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The rush of adrenaline left her light-headed as Dotty wrapped her arms around her, guiding her back toward the bed. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Who was that?" Clara stammered, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know, child," Dotty said softly, holding her tightly. "But we need to get help. This isn't something we can handle on our own." Clara's mind raced, the threads of fear and confusion weaving together. The husband's past? That was the only explanation she could think of. Had someone come to seek what was left of his life, to punish him for what he had done? Or worse, was this about the rumors of hidden gold? "Get the marshal," Clara said urgently, still shaking. "We need to talk to the marshal." The next morning the air in Garrett's office felt thick with tension. The sun barely pierced the thick fog that rolled over the hills outside, casting the room in a dim light. Garrett sat behind his desk, his fingers rubbing his temples as he sifted through a stack of wanted posters. His usual sharpness was absent, and the weight of the town's growing unease pressed down on him. When the door opened and Clara stepped inside, his head snapped up, his tired eyes locking on her face. There was no mistaking the urgency in her steps. She looked as if she hadn't slept a wink, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with worry. "Clara," Garrett said, rising from his chair as his protective instincts immediately kicked in. "What happened? Are you all right?" Clara closed the door behind her, her fingers trembling as she took a step closer. She looked him in the eye for a moment before speaking, her voice edged with anxiety. "Someone tried to break into my room last night. I heard them, Garrett. I couldn't see who it was, but they came to the door. They were trying to get in." His gaze darkened, the immediate concern for her safety evident in the tension of his jaw. "Did they get in?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Clara answered quickly, her breath catching as she recalled the fear that had consumed her. "I screamed, and the others heard it. They ran off when they saw Dotty and the others coming, but it felt like they knew exactly where to go. They weren't just looking for anything in particular, they knew where I was." Gareth's fingers flexed against the desk, the strain in his shoulders unmistakable. The possibility that this was connected to her husband's past was too real to ignore. "Did they leave anything behind?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of new information. Clara hesitated, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. "No," she said softly, then added, "But I think it's about my husband, his past." The words hung heavy in the air. Garrett's brow furrowed, and the harsh reality of Clara's situation settled in with more force. He had his suspicions about the motives behind the intrusion, but hearing Clara speak so openly about the connection to her late husband's secrets made his heart tighten with conflicting emotions. There was the lawman in him, the duty to protect the town and his own sense of justice, and then there was the part of him that had begun to see Clara not as just a victim of circumstance, but as someone with a fire inside her, someone he could not help but admire. "Garrett, I don't know what to do." Clara's voice broke slightly and she looked down at the floor. "Who would come after me? Why would anyone want to hurt me?" Garrett pushed his chair back, his fingers curling into his palms as he tried to rein in the flood of emotions swirling in him. "I don't know, Clara, but we'll figure it out. I'll station a deputy outside your saloon. You need to be careful. People can get desperate when there's gold involved. And I've heard rumors about treasure being hidden out in the hills. Maybe these men are here for that. Either that or they're looking for something else. Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of hope. But the look he gave her was one she had seen many times before, the face of a man caught between duty and desire. She didn't know whether he was offering protection because of his responsibility as the marshal, or because he had come to care for her more than he'd ever intended. Either way, the tension between them had shifted. "Thank you, Garrett," she said softly. "I don't know who else I could turn to." Garrett gave her a curt nod, his lips pressing together as if he had more to say, but couldn't bring himself to voice it. He turned toward the window, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. "I'll get someone posted, and I'll make sure you're safe, but you need to know, Clara, it's only a matter of time before those men come looking for something." Clara's chest tightened as the fear took root again. She had hoped that her husband's secrets would stay buried, but now they were unraveling before her eyes. She was caught between her past and the danger it had stirred up. As Garrett moved to the door, Clara stood still, her mind whirling with confusion and fear. She knew she was only beginning to understand the dangers surrounding her, and Garrett's role in this web of secrets was one she still wasn't sure she could trust. Garrett paused at the door, turning briefly to look at her. The unspoken words lingered in the air between them. "We'll figure this out," he said, but there was a hard edge to his voice, the undertones of something he wasn't saying. When he left, Clara stood alone in the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She could feel the threat growing closer, like a storm gathering on the horizon. And she knew deep down that the storm would soon break. Clara knelt down, her knees protesting against the rough wood floor of the Rising Phoenix saloon. She had been meaning to get around to fixing the persistent squeaking of the floorboards for days now, and today, in the quiet afternoon with no customers in sight, she had finally found the time. The saloon was still undergoing renovations, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and the occasional crack of wood as workmen hammered away in the back. Her fingers worked quickly, prying at the edge of the loose floorboard she had been eyeing for a while. It had been creaking incessantly, and now was the perfect opportunity to put it to rest. The board lifted with a slight resistance, its age showing in the rough edges and the dust that puffed up when she finally pried it free. But as she lifted it, she felt something beneath it, something she hadn't expected. Her breath caught, and she paused for a moment, eyes narrowing. Beneath the floorboard, nestled in the dark space, was a small compartment. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She reached down cautiously, her fingers brushing against something smooth, cold to the touch. Slowly she pulled it free. It was an old, weathered piece of parchment, yellowed with age and frayed at the edges. She held it in the light, her pulse quickening as she examined it. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed it open on the floor, trying not to tear the delicate paper. The writing was faint, the ink faded, but the lines on the page seemed deliberate, like a secret carefully guarded. It was a map. Her eyes traced the markings, the jagged lines that curved and looped toward a place in the nearby hills, an area she recognized. There were a few landmarks scrawled on the map, half erased by time, but the most striking feature was the faint X at the end of the route. A place marked for something hidden, something valuable. Her heart leapt as a cold realization settled over her. The town had been buzzing with rumors for months, stories of an abandoned gold mine in the hills, a treasure lost to time and the harshness of the land. The rumors had always felt like just that, whispers, gossip, things that didn't touch the reality of her life. But now, holding this map in her hands, Clara could no longer ignore the truth. This wasn't just a forgotten relic from her husband's past. This was something else entirely. Her late husband had been part of the outlaw world. Rumors of his connections to stolen riches and hidden treasures had always been just that, rumors. But now the map made it clear. Her husband had been hunting for something that had led him here. Had this been the reason he kept his secrets from her? Was this what had brought danger to their doorstep? A cold shiver ran down Clara's spine, and she quickly tucked the map back into the compartment, closing the floorboard tightly behind her. Her hands were shaking, her mind racing with the implications of what she had found. Had the break-in been about the map? Had someone come looking for it? The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. She had never imagined that her life, so carefully constructed around the remnants of a past she thought she knew, could suddenly be in jeopardy again. Her heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and excitement. This could solve everything: the gold, the treasure, the one thing that could secure her future, that could lift her from the heavy burden of debts. But at what cost? She had already lost so much, and now she found herself caught between the possibility of a fortune and the looming danger that followed her husband's shadow. Clara rose, her hands trembling, and walked over to the back of the bar, where she paused to steady her breath. Her reflection in the small mirror above the shelf seemed a stranger to her now, a woman with a secret in her hands, and a future she couldn't predict. The door creaked open, and she turned to find Dotty standing in the doorway, her expression concerned. "You all right, Clara?" she asked gently, stepping into the room. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara glanced at the small compartment, then back at Dotty. Her heart raced as she tried to collect herself. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. She tried to smile, but it felt thin. I found something." Dotty tilted her head, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated, unsure of how to explain. Her mind spun with all the possible consequences of what she had discovered. Could she trust Dotty? Could she trust anyone with this knowledge? After all, Garrett's warning still echoed in her mind. The rumours of gold were not just idle gossip. Dangerous men were on the hunt, and now so was she. But she couldn't keep the secret, not from Dotty, not any more. "I found something from my husband's past," Clara confessed, her voice quieter now. "A map. It's a treasure map, Dotty, the kind of treasure they say is hidden in the hills." Dotty's eyes widened and her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then, slowly, Dotty nodded. "Well," she said softly, "that changes things, doesn't it?" Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. She could feel the weight of the map still pressing on her mind, its secrets and promises heavy in her chest. Later that evening, Clara stood at the window, staring out into the darkening street. The saloon was quiet now, the bustling patrons having long since left for their homes. She should have gone to bed, should have rested, but sleep felt impossible with the map and its potential dangers so close. A quiet knock on the door pulled her attention away from her thoughts. She opened it to find Garrett standing in the hallway, his face drawn and weary. He didn't speak right away, he just looked at her, his eyes scanning her face. After a long moment, he sighed. "I've been thinking about what happened earlier, Clara, about what I said. I didn't mean to—" "Don't," Clara interrupted, her voice tight with the emotions that had been building inside her. "Don't apologize, Garrett. You were right to be angry. But there's more to it than you know, more than you understand." He stepped into the room, his gaze catching hers. "What do you mean?" Clara swallowed hard, her heart beating faster. She couldn't tell him yet. She couldn't tell him everything. But the map, the treasure, she felt it burning inside her, a truth she could no longer ignore. "There's something I need to show you," she said softly, her voice trembling. The weight of her words hung between them, and Garrett's expression hardened. He could feel the shift, the pull toward something neither of them had expected. The dangers of the past had caught up with Clara, and with him, whether he was ready or not. Clara turned, her fingers brushing against the edge of the bar, then walked over to the loose floorboard. Garrett stood still, his eyes fixed on her as she slowly lifted the board, revealing the hidden compartment beneath. She didn't say a word as she pulled out the map and handed it to him. Garrett took it, his eyes scanning the markings quickly. His face went pale as he recognized the faint sketch of the hills and the unmistakable X marking the treasure. "This was your husband's," he murmured. A mix of disbelief and something darker flashing across his features. "This is what they've been after," He looked up at Clara, his gaze hardening. "And now they know you have it." Clara felt the weight of his words, the heaviness of the secret she had uncovered, and the realization of what it all meant. Danger was closing in. The saloon was quiet, too quiet, with only the soft flicker of lanterns casting long shadows across the floor. The evening crowd had dissipated, and Clara had closed the doors early, wanting to speak with Garrett in private. Her mind was heavy with the weight of the map, its implications, and the dangers it could bring. The feeling of it in her hand had been a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. It was tied to secrets and lies she never asked for, secrets she was now desperate to unravel. When Garrett entered, his face serious, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, Clara straightened at the bar. She gestured for him to take a seat, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "Garrett," she began, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts in her mind, "I found something I need to show you." He moved toward her, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The tension in his shoulders was visible, and Clara couldn't help but wonder if he had sensed, as she had, that the calm in the town would not last. The map, her husband's hidden treasure map, was now a burden, and she had no choice but to share it with him. Her hands shook as she slid the half-map out of the drawer, carefully placing it on the bar in front of him. She opened it slowly, revealing the markings that were so familiar, yet now they felt so distant. "This was my husband's," Clara said, her voice a mix of pride and sorrow. "He kept it hidden, and I—" She stopped herself, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I didn't know what it was until now. But Garrett, this is what the outlaws are after. This is the map to the gold in the hills." Garrett's brow furrowed as he leaned in, studying the map with an intensity that made Clara's heart beat faster. His fingers brushed the edge of the parchment, and for a moment he seemed lost in the implications of it all. Before he could speak, the door to the saloon slammed open, and a cold gust of night air swept through the room. Clara gasped, her body going rigid as she turned to face the intruders. A group of armed outlaws stood in the doorway, their eyes cold and calculating. They had clearly heard the rumors, and now they were here for the very thing Clara had tried so desperately to protect. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, grinned maliciously. "Well, well, well," he sneered, his voice gravelly. "Looks like we've come to the right place after all." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she quickly glanced toward Garrett. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. "Get away from the bar, lady," the outlaw leader growled, stepping toward her, his hand gripping his gun. "We know what you've got, and we're here to take it." Gareth's hand was already on his revolver, but he hesitated, trying to assess the situation. Clara's pulse raced, her eyes darting to the drawer where she had hidden the map. She couldn't let them find it. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding what it all meant. Her fingers flew to the drawer, but before she could lock it away, one of the outlaws reached across the bar, slamming the drawer open with a force that sent her stumbling back. Clara cried out, her hands shaking as she tried to protect the map. In the chaos that followed, a struggle broke out. The outlaws pushed her aside, rifling through the contents of the bar, demanding the map. But it wasn't fast enough. In the frantic movement, the parchment was yanked from Clara's hands. The outlaw's leader grabbed it, and as he did, the delicate paper tore in half, the jagged edges sending a sickening lurch through Clara's stomach. One piece of the map remained in the outlaw leader's hand, the other in Clara's grasp, her fingers clutching it tightly. For a moment the room seemed to stand still, Clara's heart pounding in her chest as she looked at the torn pieces of the map. "This is what we came for," the outlaw leader said, his grin widening as he held up the piece he had taken. He turned to his men, signaling them to back off, his gaze never leaving Clara. "We'll be back for the other half. Don't go running, lady. We'll find you." Before she could protest or make any move, the outlaws retreated into the night, disappearing into the darkness as swiftly as they had come. The door slammed shut behind them with a final ominous thud. Clara stood frozen, the piece of the map still clutched tightly in her hands, her breath ragged in her chest. The saloon, once a place of hope and new beginnings, now felt like a prison, a place filled with echoes of what she had lost and what was yet to come. Garrett's voice cut through the silence. "Clara," he said, his voice tight, the strain in his tone unmistakable. "Are you all right?" She turned toward him, her chest rising and falling with the rapid beats of her heart. "They took part of it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They took the map!" Garrett's face went pale, his hand gripping the edge of the bar as he stepped closer to her. "It's gone. Half of it's gone." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had spent so much time hoping for a chance at something better, something more. But now it seemed that all she had were fragments of the past, torn and scattered. The treasure, the gold, the life she'd dreamed of. It was slipping further and further out of her grasp. Garrett's hand hovered at his side, his usual stoic expression now twisted with guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "I should have been faster. I should have protected you." Clara shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Garrett, you did what you could." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the truth. What had happened tonight was bigger than them both. The outlaws were just the beginning, and now, with only half the map, the danger was closer than ever. As Garrett stepped back, his hand resting on the edge of the bar, Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of the loss pressing down on her. She had been so close to solving the mystery, so close to securing her future, but now it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the torn map in her hands. Half of it was gone, and with it, so were her hopes for a better life. The saloon, once a beacon of possibility, now stood as a symbol of all the things she had lost, and the danger that was closing in around her. "I don't know what to do now," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked at the torn fragments of the map. "I don't know if I can keep going." Garrett's eyes softened as he watched her, and for a moment the hardness in his gaze melted away. But the storm that had broken between them wasn't over. It had only just begun. Clara clutched the map tighter, feeling the weight of it and the weight of everything that had brought her here, pressing down on her shoulders, and as the night swallowed the saloon whole, Clara knew that the battle for her future and her heart was far from over. Clara's boots clicked sharply on the dirt-packed street, each step echoing louder than the last as she walked through Canyon's End. The morning light was harsh, exposing the scuff marks on the crumbled buildings. The town that had once seemed full of promise now weighed down by an unsettling quiet. The atmosphere had changed overnight. Windows were boarded up, and the familiar bustle of the town had turned into whispers. Her heart beat with dread as she passed familiar faces, each one avoiding her gaze or whispering behind their hands. The recent events at the Rising Phoenix Saloon had left their mark. The outlaws' raid and the town's escalating fears had made Clara a pariah. No longer the woman they had once regarded with polite curiosity, she was now a symbol of the chaos that had arrived at Canyon's End. As Clara walked further down the street, she could hear the murmurs of the townspeople. Their voices were low, hushed, but each word seemed to pierce her heart like a needle. "Did you hear?" one woman whispered to another, her eyes flickering toward Clara. "She's the one who brought all this trouble. They say the men came for something she's hiding. Her husband's past, maybe." A man nearby shook his head, spitting into the dirt. "She should have never opened that saloon here. Too much bad blood, too many rumors. Now look at us, hiding behind closed doors, waiting for the next fight." Clara pressed her lips together, fighting the sting of their words. She had thought that the town might come to accept her, to see her as someone who could build something worthwhile. But now, with every glance, she felt more like an outsider, a woman whose past had caught up with her in the worst way possible. Deputy Bill was trying his best to keep order, standing on the corner of the street and speaking to a group of townsfolk. He caught sight of Clara and gave her a sympathetic nod, but she could see the hesitation in his eyes, the unspoken questions. He didn't know how to protect her, not with the whole town turning against her. Now, regret, as Clara continued down the street, a deep loneliness settled over her. She had come to Canyon's End with a dream, one of acceptance, of prosperity, of building something that would last. But now it felt as if everything she had worked for was unraveling before her eyes. The saloon that had promised so much was now a broken reflection of her shattered hopes. With a heavy heart, Clara turned and headed back to the Rising Phoenix, dreading what she would find when she reached it. The saloon had always been a refuge, but now it felt more like a tomb. Inside, the wreckage was worse than she had imagined. Tables were overturned, glass shattered across the floor, and the once lively atmosphere felt cold and abandoned. The smell of dust and broken wood filled the air, and Clara's stomach twisted as she surveyed the damage. It was as if the chaos of the night had bled into the very bones of the building. Clara's gaze moved toward the bar where the torn map was hidden. For the first time since discovering it, she wondered if it had been a curse, more than a blessing. Her hand reached for the drawer where she had hidden the other half of the map, and she breathed a quiet sigh of relief when she found it untouched. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Garrett standing in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his face pale with exhaustion. His eyes met hers, and there was an unmistakable weight in his gaze. Guilt, regret, and something else she couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice raw. "I should have been here sooner." Clara didn't speak right away. She couldn't. The emotional wall that had been building between them ever since the night of the map felt too thick to breach. She had trusted him, had hoped that somehow they could navigate this mess together. But in the wake of the outlaw's raid and the painful revelation about his brother, everything felt fractured. Garrett started again, his voice faltering. "I didn't protect you. I didn't protect the town. I was too late." Clara took a step toward him, her hands shaking at her sides. "You didn't know what was coming, Garrett. None of us did." But even as she said the words, doubt flickered through her mind. How could she not feel abandoned? How could she not feel betrayed, both by her late husband's secrets and by Garrett's inability to see past his anger toward his brother? Garrett's brow furrowed, his expression tense. "Clara, I don't know what to do. I want to help you, I want to protect you, but I don't know how. I'm torn between my duty as the marshal and what's growing between us. What I feel for you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't said the words aloud before, but she had known, hadn't she? That strange pull, that spark that had been there since the moment they met. She wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that it was real, that it could survive the weight of all the lies, the anger and the fear that were swirling between them. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your duty," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you have to understand. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if my husband ever really loved me, or if I was just someone he used to get what he wanted. I don't know if I was just a pawn in his game. And now you're telling me that I've become part of a legacy I never wanted." Garrett's eyes flashed with frustration, and he stepped closer to her, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying to see past the past. But every time I think I'm getting close to understanding, every time I feel like I can move forward, something else happens. I can't forget that my brother's past nearly destroyed everything I've worked for. I can't forget that it's still threatening you." "I'm trying to," Clara said, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "But I can't do this alone. I need you, Garrett. I need you to help me face this. We need to face this together." The raw honesty of her words seemed to hit Garrett harder than anything he had said. He stepped back, his shoulders tense, and turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can, Clara. I don't know if I can protect you from the mess my brother left behind. I can't be the man you need me to be if I am still carrying that anger around." Clara's heart shattered at the admission, the words falling like a weight around them both. The space between them seemed to stretch wider with every passing second, and as much as she wanted to bridge that gap, she couldn't find the strength. Not anymore. "I don't know who I am anymore," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was building something real, something that could stand the test of time. But now it feels like everything I touch falls apart." Garu's face twisted with the pain of his own guilt, his eyes dark with the weight of everything he had failed to do. "Clara," he whispered, I'm so damn sorry." But the apology wasn't enough, not with everything they had lost, not with everything they couldn't seem to fix. The damage had already been done, and the walls between them felt insurmountable now. Clara turned away, her heart heavy as she faced the wreckage of the saloon. It was a metaphor for everything she had hoped for, everything she had built and believed in, and now it felt like a hollow shell, broken and empty. "I think we both need some time," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I need to figure out what to do next. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when nothing is." Garrick nodded, his face a mask of guilt and regret before he turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the empty saloon. Clara stood there alone as the door closed behind him. She looked down at the half-map in her hands, the last piece of her husband's hidden secret, and felt the weight of everything slipping away. The saloon, the dream, the man she had thought she could trust. It all seemed so far out of reach. And as the darkness of the night settled over the town, Clara knew she was no closer to finding her way through the wreckage than she had been before. Clara sat by the window, her hands curled tightly around the teacup in front of her. The warm amber liquid did little to soothe the chill in her bones. The parlour was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of a distant clock, its rhythm echoing in the silence that had settled over the boarding-house. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the shadows deepening as the hours passed. She had been sitting like this for hours, her mind racing with the weight of the choices she had to make. The map, her husband's secret, the treasure that seemed to haunt her every waking moment, was more than just a promise of wealth. It was a curse, dragging her into a world of violence and betrayal. Yet the thought of leaving Canyon's End, of running away from the danger, felt like the ultimate surrender. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Was that really the answer? To run? Or did she have a chance to fix everything? There was a quiet knock at the door, followed by the creak of it opening. Dottie stood in the doorway, her eyes soft with understanding. She had been Clara's constant since her arrival, the one person who had seen her at her lowest and helped her rebuild when all seemed lost. Dottie's presence was a comfort, even now, when everything felt so fragile. "Clara?" Dottie's voice was gentle yet firm. "I know you've been through a lot, but don't you dare think about running. You're stronger than that. You've come too far." Clara met Dottie's gaze, the older woman's words cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Dottie. The outlaws, the lies, the saloon, everything feels like it's falling apart." Dottie stepped inside and sat down beside her, her presence like a steady anchor. "You think I haven't been there? You think I haven't wanted to pack up and leave when things got hard? But you can't, not now. Not after all you've built, and certainly not now that you've found someone who cares." Clara looked at Dottie, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about Garrett, Clara. I know he's made his mistakes and you've both been hurt, but there's something between you two. He's as torn up as you are, but he's here, isn't he? That man came to you, came looking for you after everything. That's not nothing." Clara swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't been able to admit it to herself, but Dottie was right. Garrett had always been there, even when he was consumed with anger and guilt, and now, after all that had happened, he still cared. He had shown it in his actions, even if his words had been harder to trust. Clara set her cup down, a new resolve settling in her chest. "I'm tired of running from the past, Dottie, from his past, from my own fears. It's time to face this head-on." Dottie smiled, a warmth in her eyes. "Good, and if you want to face it, you're going to need Garrett by your side. You'll need to trust him. Maybe it's time to let him in." Clara nodded slowly, her chest tightening with the weight of the decision. It wasn't just about the treasure or the saloon anymore. It was about her future, and whether she would keep running from the possibility of something real, something with Garrett. Without another word, she stood up, the determination in her steps clear. She knew what she had to do. Clara stepped out into the cool night, the full moon casting a silver glow over Canyon's End. The streets were eerily quiet, the air thick with anticipation. She had to find Garrett. They needed to work together to track down the criminals who had taken the other half of the map and to protect this town from the dangers that threatened to tear it apart. She made her way down the darkened street, the sound of her boots muffled by the dirt. The marshal's office loomed ahead, its windows dark and still. As she neared the back alley, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows, was Garrett. His face was hard, but there was a softness in his eyes as he turned to meet her gaze. He had been waiting for her just as she had been waiting for him. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice rough, "I didn't know if you'd come." "I had to," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't do this alone, Gareth. We need each other." He stepped toward her, his face etched with the lines of fatigue and regret. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I didn't want you to get pulled into my mess, but I can't stop now. We're in this together, whether we like it or not." Clara swallowed hard, her heart beating faster at the sincerity in his words. "I didn't want to believe it either, but I spent so much time running from the truth, from the past. And from you." She shook her head, her emotions rising to the surface. "But I can't run anymore. I won't." Garrett's expression softened, the hard edges of his guilt and anger slowly giving way. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the quiet of the night surrounding them. "I don't know what comes next, Clara," Garrett said finally, his voice low. "I don't know if we can fix this, if we can fix us." Clara took a deep breath, her heart steadying with a new resolve. "I don't know either, Garrett, but I know one thing. We can't do it alone. If we're going to stop these men, protect this town, we need to work together. I can't keep hiding from what's happening, not anymore." Garrett's eyes met hers, and for a brief, fleeting moment Clara saw something in him, something beyond the weight of his past, beyond the pain that had held him back. There was hope, and with it, the possibility of something she hadn't allowed herself to dream of. "We'll figure it out," Garrett said, his voice firm yet tender. "Together." Clara nodded, her hands still in his, the strength of their connection undeniable. Together. As they stood there in the moonlight, the weight of their shared purpose felt lighter, like a new chapter was about to begin. They had no idea what dangers lay ahead or how their journey would end, but for the first time Clara felt certain of one thing. She wasn't alone. The future was uncertain, but at least they had each other, and for now that was enough. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, Clara and Garrett clasped hands tightly, their resolve unshakable. They had a plan, a shared mission, and they were ready to face whatever came next. The first light of dawn cut through the horizon as Clara and Garrett rode side by side, the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves a steady beat against the rough terrain. The half-map Clara clutched in her hand felt heavy with both promise and peril. Behind them the small posse, led by Deputy Bill, followed in tense silence. Every man knew what was at stake, but no one spoke it aloud. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the journey pressing down on them like a storm waiting to break. The rugged hills of Canyon's End spread out before them, vast and untamed. The narrow canyon they were riding through wound like a snake through the landscape, the rocky walls towering above them like sentinels guarding secrets long buried. The silence was broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Clara's gaze flickered over the terrain, her mind focused on the path ahead, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the decision she had made. This wasn't just about the gold anymore, or the map. This was about her future, about choosing to stand beside Garrett, not just for the treasure, but for the chance to finally build something real. "We're close," Garrett's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He spoke in low tones, his eyes scanning the jagged edges of the canyon around them. Clara nodded, glancing down at the map. The marked X was growing nearer, and with it the certainty that the outlaws were just ahead. "The tracks are fresh," she said, pointing ahead toward a set of horse tracks barely visible in the dirt. "They must have camped here last night." Deputy Bill, who had been riding alongside the group, nudged his horse forward. "They're not far, we'll catch them." The posse continued onward, their horses picking up speed as they followed the tracks through the narrow passage, their eyes constantly shifting between the cliffs above and the trail below. Then, in the distance, they saw it. A small clearing where the canyon opened up. There, nestled against the base of the hills, was an old derelict mining camp, the wood of the structures weathered and decayed from years of abandonment. But the smoke rising from a fire at the center told them all they needed to know. The outlaws were there, hunched over the other half of the map, plotting their next move. Clara felt a cold chill settle over her, but it wasn't from the morning air. She felt it in her bones. The certainty that this confrontation would decide everything. She exchanged a glance with Garrett, who nodded slightly, his jaw clenched in determination. "We'll split up," Garrett ordered quietly. "Bill, take the left. Hank, come with me to flank them from the right. Clara, stay with Bill and make sure we don't miss anything." Clara gave a quick nod, though she knew the risk was high. She was no stranger to danger now, but this felt different. This was more than just a battle for the map. It was a fight for her future, for the peace she had hoped to build in Canyon's End. As they neared the edge of the camp, the wind howled between the rocks, a high-pitched whistle that carried an ominous tone. The outlaws didn't notice them at first, huddled around a makeshift table, arguing over the map. Hank leaned in close to Clara, his voice a whisper. "Once we get them surrounded, don't hesitate. We've got one shot at this." Clara's fingers tightened around the reins, and she nodded again, her heart thudding in her chest. They moved forward, slowly, quietly, until the outlaws were within sight. Then, in a flash, everything erupted. A gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. The posse exchanged fire with the outlaws, the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Garrett and Deputy Bill immediately dove for cover, returning fire with precision. Clara and Hank darted through the underbrush, moving swiftly to cut off the outlaws' escape route. The chaos was everywhere, the crack of gunshots, the curses shouted in the distance, and the sound of hooves thundering as men tried to scramble for cover. Clara's breath was sharp, her senses heightened as she sprinted toward the outlaw leader who had his back turned, his eyes focused on the map. His fingers were pressing the torn parchment together, eager to make sense of what he held. Clara was quick. Faster than she ever thought she could move, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As the outlaw leader turned toward her, his eyes narrowing in disbelief, she grabbed the piece of the map from his hands. "You're not getting this," she shouted, holding the map tightly against her chest. The outlaw leader snarled and lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm, but Clara was ready. She twisted free, pulling the map out of his reach, just as Garrett appeared at the other end of the camp, his gun drawn and aimed. "Let her go!" Garrett's voice was a command, sharp and unwavering. The outlaw leader hesitated, glancing at Garrett, then at Clara, his face twisted in anger and frustration. "You think you've won? This ain't over!" With a swift motion, Garrett took a step forward, his gun steady. "It is now," he said. Another shot rang out, and the outlaw leader dropped his half of the map, his fingers twitching as he collapsed to the ground. Clara let out a breath, her chest tight with the adrenaline of the moment. She reached down and snatched up the second half of the map, holding both pieces in her hand. The outlaws were subdued quickly, their guns taken and their hands bound. Deputy Bill worked quickly to round them up, making sure there were no more surprises hiding among the rocks. Hank, with a satisfied nod, turned to Clara and Garrett. "Well, looks like we've got ourselves a treasure hunt after all," Hank said with a wink, though there was no humour in his tone. Clara looked at Garrett, her heart still racing. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The chaos of the fight had faded, leaving behind a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of the wind whistling through the canyon. Finally Garrett reached for Clara's hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. His touch was steady, a reassurance after everything they had been through. "We did it," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. Garrett nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of the victory. "We did. But this isn't over. Not yet." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the abandoned mine, Clara felt the weight of the map in her hands, but also something else, something lighter, something hopeful. Together they had faced the outlaws. Together they had won. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara believed they could face whatever came next. Together. As Garrett led the way back to the horses, Clara followed, a heart lighter than it had been in days. The future was still uncertain, but she no longer felt alone in facing it. They had won the day. And that, for now, was enough. The sun was setting over Canyon's End, casting a warm, golden light across the street, as the small group gathered outside the Rising Phoenix saloon. Clara stood at the threshold, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood of the doorframe, her eyes scanning the familiar surrounding. The last few days had been a whirlwind, a battle with outlaws, a fractured past, and now the weight of a new decision that would shape not only her future, but the future of the entire town. Beside her, Garrett stood tall, his hand resting on his belt as he looked out over the gathered townsfolk. His marshal's badge gleamed in the last rays of sunlight, a reminder of the responsibility he had carried for so long. But today there was a different weight on his shoulders. He had always believed that law and order were the only ways to bring peace. But Clara had shown him that sometimes love and trust could build something stronger than any law. "The map is real," Clara said softly, her voice carrying just enough for Garrett to hear. She glanced at him, her fingers still nervously playing with the hem of her dress. "The gold is real. But we can't let it destroy this town." Garrett nodded, his gaze unwavering. They had spent hours going over the map, every curve, every line, every marker. The legendary mine, hidden away in the hills, was more than a rumor. It was real, and it was theirs to protect. But as they had discussed, greed had a way of corrupting everything it touched. The town could easily descend into chaos if word got out about the gold. "We can't let this be about us," Gareth said, his voice resolute. "If we do this right, it's about protecting this place, protecting the people." Clara met his gaze, her heart swelling with the same determination. "I think we should talk to the authorities," she said, the decision coming to her in a quiet moment of clarity. "We'll let the territory's officials manage the prospecting, but the town should benefit as a whole, not just a few people, not just the ones who can take advantage of the chaos." Garrett smiled, pride filling his chest. "Well, that's a noble decision, and it's one that'll save Canyon's End." The townsfolk had gathered outside the saloon, watching with quiet curiosity. Clara took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding. She cleared her throat, calling for attention. "Folks," she began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet authority, "we've come to a decision. The gold in the hills is real, but I'm not going to let it tear this town apart. We will safeguard it. We'll work with the authorities to make sure this town benefits as a whole. We won't let greed take us down a path we don't want to go." There was a murmur of approval, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt the eyes of the town not full of judgment, but of respect. They had been skeptical of her at first, but now, with the weight of the decision in her hands, they could see the strength she possessed. The rumors had turned to admiration. Clara had shown them that integrity was stronger than any fortune. As the evening wore on, the Rising Phoenix saloon was transformed. The boards that had once covered the windows were now removed, revealing a welcoming glow from within. The saloon was bustling with life again. Locals, travellers, and the familiar faces of Canyon's End filled the room. Laughter floated through the air, accompanied by the soft strumming of a guitar. Clara stood behind the bar, her eyes scanning the room. She was no longer just the widow who had brought a saloon to town. She was a woman who had built something real, something that could stand the test of time. She had faced danger, betrayal, and loss, and had come through it all stronger. As the doors opened, Garrett entered, his hat in hand. He paused in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers across the room. For a moment, everything around them seemed to fade. There was no noise, no bustling saloon, only the two of them. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She was no longer the same woman who had stepped into this town a few months ago. She had found something more than gold. She had found respect and love, and the strength to build a future. Garrett made his way over to her, removing his hat as he approached the bar. His expression was soft, but there was an intensity in his eyes that spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, leaning in closer. "I couldn't save my brother's soul, but I found peace in protecting you, in caring for you." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't easy for him to say these things, not when his brother's betrayal had left scars deeper than anyone could see. But here, now, Garrett was offering something that felt real, something that wasn't tainted by the past. "I couldn't save him either," Clara whispered, her hand reaching for his. "But I'm ready to move forward. I've spent so much time clinging to the past, to the secrets I didn't understand. But I know now what I want. And what I want is you. I want a future with you. One that's built on honesty, on trust." A smile tugged at Garrett's lips, a smile that reached his eyes and softened the hardness that had once dominated his face. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, the touch gentle but filled with an undeniable connection. "I've wanted that too," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "More than anything." And then, in a quiet corner of the saloon, with the noise of the world fading around them, they kissed. It was soft, tender, the kind of kiss that spoke of new beginnings and old wounds finally healing, the promise of love and of a future that was theirs to create. The night continued, but for Clara and Garrett the world had shifted. They had made a choice, not just to stand together against the dangers they had faced, but to stand together for the future they wanted to build. Outside, the last light of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. Clara and Garrett stood together on the saloon's front porch, looking out at the town they had both come to love. The bustling street in front of them was full of life, full of the promise of what lay ahead. Clara glanced at Garrett, her hands slipping into his. She was no longer the lonely widow who had walked into Canyon's End so many months ago. She was a woman with a future, one that she had built with her own hands. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Clara whispered, squeezing his hand. Garrett smiled, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "And we've still got a long way to go, but we'll face it together." The silhouette of their entwined hands stood out against the dying light of the sunset, a symbol of all they had overcome and all they had yet to discover. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities, full of hope, and with Garrett by her side, she knew there was nothing they couldn't face together. The new dawn had arrived, and it was theirs to embrace.